In November 1988, in a first grade classroom in Newton, Massachusetts, a teacher held a presidential election. Each 6-year-old circled a name on a slip of paper, Michael Dukakis or George Bush, folded it, and dropped it in a shoebox on her desk. At the end of the day, she counted the votes and announced the result. Dukakis 20, Bush 1. One of those 20 was Tim Urban, and decades later, he opened a chapter of his book with that shoebox because of what it proves. Not one child in that room could have named a policy. None of them knew what a tax was, or a treaty, or a trade deficit. And yet 20 out of 21 already knew the way you know which end of the pool is deep, which candidate was the nice good guy, and which was the mean bad guy. As Urban tells it, that certainty arrived years before any information did. The information, when it finally showed up, would be hired to explain a verdict rendered in first grade. So here's the question this episode turns on. Where does a 6-year-old's politics come from? Because wherever that is, that's where most of yours came from too. Let's get one thing out of the way because this episode is not an argument for centrism, and neither is Urban's book. Take the axis we built in episode 2, how you think, not what you think, and lay it over politics. Up on the high rungs, political disagreement isn't a malfunction. It's the machine working. People fight over what's actually true, over what a fair country would look like, over how to get there from here. And the fights are fierce because the questions are hard and nobody has the answer sheet. Even the two teams make sense up there. In Urban's telling, progressivism and conservatism aren't identities. They're functions. One is the gas pedal. No country improves without change. The other is the brakes. Most new ideas are bad, and somebody has to say so. A driver needs both feet. Each side sees exactly the blind spots the other can't, which means a country thinks best when they're the same trick from episode 3, scaled up to a nation, a diversity of biases, canceling. So if you've ever wondered how someone reasonable could possibly vote the other way, that's the answer. On the high rungs, they're your counterweight, not your enemy. The disease isn't disagreement. The disease is what happened to it. But there's a bigger world of politics below the high rungs, and Urban gives it the name this episode wears, political Disney world. A Disney movie runs on binary code, pure good and pure evil, ones and zeros, and even the weather takes sides. Which is exactly right for its audience, because its audience is children who need to learn good versus bad before they can handle complicated. The trouble starts when adults process the actual world that way. The real world is gray all the way down. Real people are microcosms of it. Everyone a mixed bag. Political Disney world deletes the gray. Good politicians and bad ones. Good policies and bad ones. Good election results and stolen ones. And each kingdom comes with a story. In the Blue Kingdom's story, as Urban tells it, righteous citizens struggle to carry the country toward progress, while bigots try to drag it backward into a land run by corporations and cruelty. In the Red Kingdom's story, honest, hard-working families hold the country together, while elitists and their handout armies pull it down into decadence and tyranny. Notice the engineering. The two stories are incompatible in every detail and identical in structure. Each casts its own team as the protagonist. The other is the villain, and the viewer, you as a hero, just for showing up. No story that flattering is ever free. The kingdoms even have their own ecology of ideas. Up on the high rungs, conspiracy theories get processed. The false ones die under scrutiny, and the true ones, the scandals that turn out to be real, work their way into the record. Political Disney world has no such filter, only the narrative test. Does the theory make the bad guys look bad? Then it lives, which is why, as Urban points out, so many long disproven theories never seem to die. They did die years ago up on the high rungs. They live on down below, where nothing that flatters the story can be killed. Here's the test that tells you which world someone's politics lives in, and it's not which side they're on. Watch what happens when their team and their principles collide. When the other side suppresses speech or abuses power or torches a norm, everyone's outraged, that costs nothing. The reveal comes when your own side does the same thing. On the high rungs, the principal holds and the team takes the criticism. In political Disney World, the principle quietly reverses itself. And if you look at the last few decades of American arguments about executive power or deficits or protests or presidential character, you can watch entire crowds swap scripts with each other the moment the White House changes hands, each reciting word for word what the other crowd was saying 4 years earlier. It wasn't always like this. And the way it changed is a machine worth watching because nobody's hands are on the levers. Go back to the middle of the 20th century, and America's two parties were ideologically scrambled, each one a roomy, contradictory coalition, full of people who'd fight their own side as readily as the other. Division was everywhere, but it was distributed, spread across factions and regions in a world war's worth of foreign enemies. Then, over a generation, the scramble sorted. The civil rights era forced both parties to decide who they were. Conservative Democrats and progressive Republicans gradually traded places. And each party, unwilling to loudly disown its own hardest line faction, slowly became the place for people who feared the other party's hardliners. Two roomy coalitions purified into two ideological teams. Then the sorting went cultural, and this is where it gets personal. Here's a result from a famous 1971 model of segregation. You don't need bigots to produce total separation. Run the simulation with people who are perfectly happy with diversity and have just one small preference, not to be badly outnumbered by neighbors unlike them. And the map still ends up fully segregated, small individual bias, large collective bias. Now, give the two parties cultural uniforms. Urban's honest generalization list runs from Whole Foods to Cracker Barrel, from the Times to Fox, avocado toast to NASCAR, and every ordinary, innocent choice to live near people like us quietly doubles as a political relocation. By one much argued measure, the share of Americans living in landslide counties where one party wins by 20 points or more went from about a quarter of the country in 1976 to nearly 6 in 10 by 2020. And homogeneous rooms don't just agree. Episode 3 told you what they do. In 2007, researchers sat citizens of Boulder, a liberal city, and Colorado Springs, a conservative one, in small groups with their own neighbors to discuss 3 hot issues. Nobody was arguing with the other side. There was no other side in the room. After mere hours of talking with people who already agreed with them, the liberals had moved left, the conservatives had moved right, and the gap between the cities had widened. The rooms did what rooms do. Now the room is the county. And here's the strangest fact in the whole research literature. One urban is careful to flag. Americans' actual opinions haven't drifted to the extremes nearly as much as you'd think. On the issues themselves, the center is still crowded. What's exploded is something else. The researchers call it affective polarization, not how far apart we are, but how much we dislike each other across the line. We didn't become a country of extremists. We became a country of enemies with moderate views. Here's the number that proves it. In 1960, researchers asked American parents how they'd feel if their child married someone from the other party. About 4% of Democrats and 5% of Republicans said they'd be displeased. It barely registered as a question, like asking how they'd feel about a son-in-law who preferred a different car company. In 2019, the same question found 45% of Democrats and 35% of Republicans unhappy at the thought. In 2 generations, party went from a preference to a bloodline, from something you held to something you are. Episode 2 gave you the words for that. So run the test on yourself. It takes 10 seconds. Pick your position on any one political issue. Now, ask, could a stranger who knows that single fact predict your positions on abortion, guns, climate, immigration, and taxes? Be honest, could they run the whole checklist? Because those issues have almost nothing to do with each other. There's no logical thread connecting a view on marginal tax rates to a view on gun policy to a view on climate modeling. If your answers line up anyway, all of them on one team's list, then at least some of those conclusions were not conclusions. They came with the uniform, the way mine did. I can tell you exactly what my zip code, my coffee, and my podcast queue predict about my ballot, and the honest answer to how much of my politics did I reason my way into. Embarrassed me when I finally did the math on it. 20-1. And I was 6. A sorted country is a stable formation. In its way, 2 kingdoms, 2 stories, everyone in uniform. But formations like that have a vulnerability. When an audience is that loyal, that predictable, that afraid of the other gate, it stops being a public and becomes a market. And markets get served. Next time, what happens when politicians, primaries, and a brand new kind of media all discover one incentive at a time, with nobody deciding it and everyone responding rationally, that this market pays better for war than for governing? It's the story the book calls the downward spiral. And fair warning, because the season owes you this, watching it happen to one party will feel, if you're on the other team, wonderful. That feeling is the subject of this whole series.